So I've got 3 pieces of braised pork here. The first one is undercooked. That is, I didn't let it cook quite long enough. It is still firm and rubbery. The second one is overcooked. I let it cook too long and it's become so mushy that it's almost like a paste, a dry paste in fact. And finally, this one is perfectly cooked. So it holds its shape, but with a little bit of force, you can pull it apart into nice shreds, nice juicy shreds. So today, we're going to learn how to know when your pork is done right, and we're going to be making the stew of violence from The Simpsons. Today, I stews violence. Hey everyone, it's Kenji. Today we're going to make the stew of violence from The Simpsons. So why am I making a recipe from The Simpsons? I'm not pulling a Babish here. This recipe is actually mine. So a few months back, I was contacted by the editorial team at The Simpsons. And they reached out to me and my podcast partner, Deb Perlman of Smitten Kitchen, and said that they wanted to feature us in an episode of The Simpsons and needed a recipe for it. And so if you haven't seen the episode, it's about Homer getting in trouble with Fat Tony, the mob boss. And Fat Tony explains to him that he used to be in the Prussian mafia, and they had this one dish called the stew of violence. And it's the dish that it becomes the sort of the MacGuffin of the episode. But it turns out that the stew of violence is a thing that brings peace to everyone. The recipe I sent them is based roughly on not even roughly. It's essentially a sauerbraten, so a German sauerbraten, which translates to sour fry. But really, it's a braise. So a braise is any stew-like thing, or if you're not that comfortable with stews yet, you can call them the steward of violence. But a braise is essentially any stew-like thing where you start by browning meat or vegetables, and then you slow cook them in a moist environment. I'm going to use a braising pan right here. So this is a heavy cast iron braising pan. It holds about 4 quarts. You could do this in a Dutch oven as well. However, you do want a pan that has a sort of wide open top, because one of the essential parts of a braise is that the liquid in it is going to reduce a little bit. And so you're going to get a nice sort of thick, rich, intensely flavored sauce. The cut of meat I'm using here is pork shoulder. When an animal is alive, a pig, a deer, a deer from the forests of Prussia, a chicken, a cow, the more the animal uses a particular muscle in its lifetime, generally there's a correlation between the muscle usage and the amount of flavor that you're going to get in it. But there's also a correspondence between the muscle usage and the amount of connective tissue you have in there. So muscles that the animals use frequently tend to be more flavorful, but also tougher. So a cut like pork shoulder, the shoulder of the pig's walking around all the time carrying all that weight. It uses it very frequently during its life. So pork shoulder is not something that you would necessarily want to make a steak out of because it's going to be tough. However, it does have a lot of good flavor. There's a lot of connective tissue which you can see in here, a lot of good fat. And so you want to treat those in a different way than you're going to treat like a pork chop or a steak. With these ones, braising, what it does is that as the meat cooks in a moist environment, all of that connective tissue, which is largely made up of collagen, in a moist environment, there's a reaction that occurs between water, collagen, and heat that forms gelatin, which is tender and has a sort of mouth-coating texture to it. All right, so I've got my pork here. I'm going to season it with some salt, a little bit of MSG. And you might notice I'm not seasoning as heavily as I often do here. The reason is because whenever you're making a dish where the liquid in the dish is going to reduce, where you're starting with a larger volume of liquid and reducing it down to a smaller volume, you want to be careful with your seasoning, because as the liquid reduces, most of the stuff that's coming out of that liquid is just water that's evaporating. The water might carry along a few aromatics with it, a few larger molecules, but the salt is mainly going to stay in the pot. And so when you're reducing a liquid, what happens is that the salt intensifies. So you don't want to season your meat as heavily as you would, say, a steak or a pork chop. You want to season it very gently. All right, nice hot pan, high heat, a little bit of olive oil. I'm going to get my meat in there. So when I braise this meat, or when I brown this meat, I'm going to cover it just because over the years I've found that while keeping it uncovered does sort of encourage evaporation, which gives you better browning, it also creates a huge mess in your kitchen. And these days I've got 2 kids, and so creating a big mess is the last thing I want to do. It's going to brown just fine with the cover on. It takes a little bit longer, but it'll end up browning just fine. Many recipes, including some that I've written, will call for browning meat for a braise on all sides. There's a trade-off between browning and texture. That trade-off being that the more brown you make your meat, the more flavor you're going to have, but you also end up making the meat tougher. Even in a braise like this, the meat's going to come out drier. Each individual cube of meat is going to come out drier than it would if you were to say not brown it at all, which is a legitimate way to go. You know, you can. I've made stew recipes, I've made chilies, things like that. There are a number of sort of dishes from Asia in particular where you don't brown the meat before you start stewing it or braising it, and they can come out very tasty. However, in the Western tradition, we tend to like those really brown flavors. So what I like to do is, rather than browning the cubes of meat on all sides, which can rob them of a lot of moisture, I'm going to brown these just on the one side. I'm going to let them really heavily brown on that one side. And then when I add my liquid in later, a lot of those flavor compounds that are developed when the meat browns are water soluble, and so they are going to end up sort of mingling in the stew and flavoring everything else. All right, so this is going to take about 10 minutes to brown, so I'm going to come back when it's ready. All right, so our meat has now been searing for about 10 minutes. You can see I left the lid just slightly ajar, actually, because you want to make sure that there is an avenue for this steam to escape. Otherwise, if you have a really heavy lid like this, it'll all end up getting trapped in there. And rather than browning, the moisture will sort of limit the temperature of the pan to the boiling temperature of water. And so instead of evaporating and browning, you end up kind of simmering and stewing your meat, which is not what you want to do yet. You want to brown it to build up flavors. So lid slightly ajar to allow steam to escape. And what you're looking for is something like this. So really nice and brown, you see that? Really nice and brown on that one side, right? And then we're gonna flip this over. And rather than wait for that second side to brown, I'm gonna go ahead and add this chopped onion. And so that onion, once you add it in there, it's gonna start releasing moisture pretty immediately as it starts to heat up. And so we're going to use that moisture to sort of deglaze the pan a little bit. Deglazing is just a fancy word for, scraping off the tasty stuff at the bottom, like what I do to my my toddler right now that he's potty training. Tiny pinch more salt, which will help those onions sort of release some of their juices. I've just been going at high heat this whole time, by the way. All right. So as those onions start to soften and brown a little bit, I'm going to get together my sachet. So a sachet is essentially just like a little pouch with aromatics in it, the things that you want to flavor the stew, but not the things that you don't actually want to eat at the end. Most call for a little pouch of cheesecloth. I'm just going to use a tea strainer that I got out of my tea kettle over there. So in my sachet, I've got a tablespoon each of black peppercorns and mustard seeds. I'm using black mustard seeds, although if I had yellow, I would probably use those instead, as well as just a half dozen allspice berries. So those are going to be our sort of Prussian forest flavors. Now we've got some bay leaves, a few sprigs of thyme, 3 cloves of garlic, and 3 little disc-sized pieces of ginger. The allspice, the ginger in particular, are sort of spices that you often associate with sweet foods. And this stew, a sauerbraten, does have some sweetness to it. You're going to see we're going to add some brown sugar to here. So it has a sort of sweet and sour flavor, but I really like the way those spices come out and sort of differentiate this from a stew that you might, like an American beef stew, for example. They also work really nicely with the pork. All right, so our onions are nice and softened here. Next, I'm going to go in with a few tablespoons of tomato paste. I always like to buy tomato paste in a tube because when you buy it in a can, it comes in those little 6-ounce cans, sometimes smaller cans, but no matter what size the can is, I've never gone through a whole can for a single recipe, or at least rarely do. And what ends up happening is that you have that can, you put it in your fridge, thinking, all right, I'll just use this the next time I use tomato paste. and then the next time you go in, it's all dried out and crusty, and you just open up a new can anyway. I think it's all a scam by big tomato paste, you know. But anyway, the tube stuff, you squeeze out as much as you need. There's no air left in it, so you can put it right back in the fridge. It's also generally, the tube stuff is double concentrated, which, you know, should mean that you need half as much, but, you know, I remember a few years back, Cooks Illustrated did some testing on this and found that even when it says double concentrated, it varies from brand to brand. So really, you know, I kind of eyeball my tomato paste. I don't mind if there's too much or too little, because the labeling doesn't really mean that much when you're talking about it. But, you know, tomato paste is going to do a couple things. It's going to enhance the, you know, bring out sort of those umami flavors. There's a lot of glutamates in tomato paste, those things that give us the sense of umami, which we're also, you know, we added a little bit of MSG here, so that's also going to bolster that. Tomato paste also adds body to the sauce. So this is not like a really thick, sort of gravy-like stew that we're making. The sauce is going to be sort of glossy and glazy, but not really thick and heavy. So we're not adding any actual thickeners other than the tomato paste in here. So there's no flour that we're adding, no cornstarch, nothing like that. It's just going to be sort of the natural gelatin that comes out of the pork shoulder, along with the tomato paste. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but the pork shoulder, I want really nice large chunks like this. You know, when I make a stew like this, I like the pieces to be sort of big enough that an individual piece you can still kind of shred it apart with a fork, or you can bite it with your teeth, because I really like the way when, you know, if you're taking the time to properly braise meat and it is perfectly done, you know, not underdone and chewy or overdone and dry, I like that sensation of biting into it and sort of feeling that texture. So I like my pieces big enough that I can taste it. The other reason you'd want to do big pieces is because, you know, the smaller you cut your meat, the more surface area it has. And so what can end up happening is that when you're trying to brown it, if the cuts of meat are too small, moisture is going to start coming out of all those open surfaces, and it becomes sort of progressively harder to brown things the smaller you cut them. You know, which is why something like, if you've ever made like, you know, stovetop tacos for taco night, for Freedom Taco Night, ground beef is really hard to brown properly. It sort of ends up stewing no matter what you do, and it's because it has that really big surface area. If you really wanted to, I have a couple recipes where I recommend that you leave your braising cuts whole, so you kind of slice them into big steaks, and you sear them as steaks, just to sort of really enhance the browning, and then afterwards take them out and cut them up into chunks. And that way you don't lose any, you know, you barely lose any moisture at all. But today I'm doing it the easy way. All right, so once your tomato paste has started to look like this, where the pieces are coated, and when you scrape the bottom of the pan, you hear you see and you hear a sort of frying noise as opposed to a simmering noise, we're ready to go in with our other liquids. So those liquids are, first, a couple cups of a dry red wine. I think if you zoom in on, if you freeze frame and you zoom in on the cell of the Simpsons episode where Fat Tony is holding the recipe, it calls for 2 cups of kobold blood, or maybe it calls for, I can't remember, or maybe some kind of elderflower or something. I don't remember. No, what does it call it? Blackcurrant. Yeah, no, it calls for blackcurrant wine. We are substituting a dry red grape wine. So a couple cups of red wine. I'm going to scrape it up here. Half a cup of red wine vinegar. This is the blood of the kobold. Again, I'm kind of just eyeballing. That's about half a cup. And finally, 4 cups of chicken stock. You can use homemade. I'm using store-bought. When you buy chicken stock from the store, you do want to go with the low sodium stuff, because again, this is going to be reducing, and we don't want it to become too salty as it reduces. All right, and to that we're also going to add our sweet element, which is brown sugar. So that's a 1/4 cup of brown sugar, which is 1, 2, 3, 4 tablespoons. We got our sweet, we have our sour, and we're just going to add our aromatic into here, which is this guy. So clear off a little space at the bottom, get them in like that, and we're good to go. All right, so now I'm just going to let this come to a simmer, and then we're going to pop it in the oven. So I'll be right back when this is simmering. All right, so we've come up to a boil. I'm going to reduce it to a bare simmer here. And I'm just going to give it a real quick skim. You don't have to skim your stews or soups or braises. However, it will make the end product come out a little bit sort of cleaner looking and a little cleaner tasting as well. That scum is mainly just sort of the proteins and coagulated bits of myoglobin and other sort of things that are in the meat being expressed and then cooking on the surface of the liquid here, along with some of the fat that's being sort of trapped in there. So yeah, cleaning it off will strictly unnecessary, but skimming does make a small but noticeable difference. Okay, so I'm just going to skim it off with a ladle. Then I'm going to pop the lid on, leaving it slightly ajar, and it's going to go straight into a 300-degree preheated oven. All right, so that is going to be in the oven for about an hour and a half before the next step. It's going to be in there a total of maybe 2.5 hours or so. With the reason we're leaving the lid slightly ajar there is because we want some of that braising liquid to reduce. We want it to continue sort of steaming and evaporating so it gets more and more concentrated. With the lid ajar, you also get a little bit of browning on the surface that we can then stir in at the end. So you're going to get a little bit more flavor that way as well. So I always do my braises with the lid slightly ajar. All right, so we will be back in an hour and a half. All right, so it has been an hour now, hour and a half. And this is what we got. So I'm gonna take these aromatics out of here for now. They've given up just about all they can give up. Our pork is not quite tender yet. So right now we're at the stage where it's cooked, but the gelatin has not yet, the collagen has not yet had a chance to break down into gelatin. But that's okay, we still got another hour left of cooking. We're going to add our vegetables now. So I got cabbage, carrots, and celery. Just make sure that it's all submerged. Pop our lid back on, slightly ajar, and back into the oven we go. It's been another hour. Our vegetables should be mostly tender. Our meat should be cooked. Let's take a look. Ooh. I'm gonna pull out a piece of meat here just to check on sort of the doneness level. What we're looking for is for it to kind of hold its shape. We don't want it to be completely mushy. We want it to have a little bit of a bite to it, but when we push it with a fork, imagine that like our molars going down on it. When we push it with a fork, it should just shred apart. There we go, just like that. See? Now, this is meat that is cooked to just the right level of doneness. There's a bit of a range, so you can go a little bit over, a little bit under, and it's still going to be fine. If you were to say, I used to have this impression that, all right, if like braising short ribs or cooking a beef stew for 3 hours is good, then like surely cooking it for 8 hours is going to be even better. And you hear like, oh yeah, I cooked that stew all day. I remember trying that once with some braised short ribs where I literally cooked them all day. And when I went to eat them, they were the driest things I've ever tasted. Like, despite the fact that they spent the day in liquid, they end up dried out. And that's because the more you cook them, the more of that connective tissue breaks down, the more fat renders out. And so you end up with just sort of the wrung out muscle proteins. It almost tastes like you're biting down on like a sponge that you've just wrung the moisture out of. So there is actually a proper amount of doneness for braised meats. So now that the meat is cooked right, the vegetables are mostly cooked, we're just going to reduce this liquid. So I'm just going to put it up at a very, very vigorous simmer. And we're going to let that liquid reduce down. Some of the stuff's going to evaporate off until it becomes a little bit thicker and a little bit glazier. It's not going to be a really thick stew, but it'll get a little bit more texture to it and certainly more intensity of flavor. That'll take probably 5 to 10 minutes or so I'll see you then. All right, so this has been simmering for about 10 minutes. Nice and reduced. It's not in the recipe, but I am going to add a little bit of butter here at the end. It's what the French call monte au beurre. And I don't know what the Germans call it. Probably something with way too many syllables. I'm also going to season. Now that we're at the end of it, we can start to season it more properly. You know, so I'm going to season with a little bit of MSG and a little bit of salt and some pepper here. That butter, you know, what it does is it kind of, well, first of all, it adds a little bit of body, you know, but it also is going to sort of mellow out all the flavors and take off some of those, you know, sharp edges. Butter, you know, dairy fat's really good at kind of coating your tongue and giving everything a smoothness. That is tasty. All right, let me do final little hit of parsley. Now, you could serve this just on its own. You could also serve it with, say, you know, noodles, spätzle, which I think that's how you pronounce it. Boiled potatoes, you know, anything really sort of simple sort of starch like that will work. Let me get my stew. Does everyone have a stew spoon? This is my stew spoon. I think everyone needs a stew spoon. Let's pull our stew out. Get some nice chunks of pork in there. Get some of that celery. Get some of that carrot. Some of that cabbage. As Michael's pointing out, all of the vegetables in this stew begin with C. Bob Seger's favorite stew. Can't you see? Cookie Monster's favorite stew. No, it's Fat Tony's favorite stew. It's everybody's favorite stew. This is the stew of violence. We walked into the kitchen this morning and we chose violence. What do you think of that, huh? Should we go eat some? Let's eat some. So when it's braised perfectly, it kind of melts in your mouth. You know, there's not much resistance, but just enough to hold itself together. And every sort of fiber of it tastes nice and juicy. You know, nailing that cooking time is really sort of the key to any braise, I think. The flavors are nice and reduced and complex. There's sweetness in there. There's acidity. It's cabbagey. It's allspicy. It's black peppery. It's bay-y. By the way, I think my written recipe told you to leave the sachet in there until the very end, but I chose to sachet away in the middle, as I'm going to do at the end of this video as well. All right, guys, gals, non-binary pals, I will see you later. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. You can find the full article and recipe along with bonus content and my newsletter for free on my Patreon. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel for more videos like this, or my alternate channel, Kenji Lopez Main, for my dining content. And follow me on Instagram at Kenji Lopez-Alt for daily updates. You can also get signed and personalized copies of any of my books. That's The Food Lab, The Walk, or my children's book, Every Night is Pizza Night, shipped from Booklarder here in Seattle. Find the links to all of this, as well as all of the tools I used in today's video, in the description below. Thanks.